quite a consistent player in that regard compared to maybe some of his more versatile rivals. And wow, the Queen's Gambit declined, but it's a really, really trendy variation. Black now creating maximum tension in the center, all these four pawns looking at each other. And yeah, Magnus, he's played this one with the black pieces recently quite a lot. He's also faced this one when he's had white. And this opening seems to be in every player's repertoire these days, Ivanka.
Yeah, it certainly does. I was actually looking at it this morning. I was discussing it with someone. And I have to say, though, I mean, it's what I really like about Ding is that he's a player who believes in his openings, and he's had some epic battles in an opening variation called the Catalan with Magnus. They've played out at least 5 or 6 times, been a lot of draws. And Ding it's like, yeah, bring it on. I want to repeat the same thing. But it's Magnus that varies. And I'm predicting here that Ding, maybe just to keep things fluid, might just push his... Oh, he actually played it just when I was about to say it. I was a bit long-winded there. And, yeah, push the king's pawn forward and just keep things flexible.
Yeah, all other options for white would have resulted in exchanges, just the position kind of simplifying, liquidating itself. The central pawns would have all disappeared. But Ding is just trying to keep maximum tension. And this is quite good in general, at least for us spectating, but also for Ding. Keeping as many pieces on the board as possible, keeping the position tense, and hoping for chances later in the game. I think Magnus, just the fact that he played this opening so quickly, he would have been studying this opening beforehand. He would have been rehearsing all of the small details, figuring out how black can equalize in the opening. But with his choice here, Ding has at least now made the world champion think. And choices for black would include, I was going to say, pushing this pawn forward. I think most likely black could have also brought out the knight. And now we see a trade of pawns in the center. And very, very similar pawn structure, actually, Ivanka, to the first game today, just with colours reversed. We have almost an identical pawn structure, and that means black might well get weaknesses. Black might even get an isolated pawn, but white now developing very quickly. I think Ding is going to castle kingside, bring his king to safety much quicker than Magnus did in the previous game. That is the big difference. And now it's up to black to decide how to clarify the structure in the centre and also how to get the black king also to safety. Yeah, and there's kind of also the pressing issue is like, do you develop your dark squared bishop? Do you capture the pawn in the middle of the board? The reason why there's a bit of hesitation as to what to do is because if you do develop your dark squared bishop, you might be obliged to waste some time. Say, for instance, white then captures the pawn. You're like, oh, I have to capture the pawn again, and I've lost time on my bishop. I have just checking the database. I can see that Magnus has actually played this particular variation with the black pieces in a banter blitz against Anish Giri. And that result was the draw. It was in the Banter Blitz Cup final. So a couple of years ago. And yeah, Magnus, so he's familiar with this position, but he's spending a bit of time. Maybe he's just thinking Ding possibly has studied that game in the past. I don't think Ding has, but you never know. And Magnus, he wants to be creative at this early stage. It's all about, at the top level, surprising your opponent in the opening, even if it's just a tiny move order change, even if it's just maybe a slight different kind of setup from your previous games. That's what it's all about. And Magnus, he's the master at finding ways to avoid his opening, his opponent's opening preparation. So, yeah, I think he's going to move one of the black bishops, or maybe capture the pawn in the centre. But if you move the bishop, where? And if you want to move a bishop, which one? A lot of choice for black. And as Ivanka says, the dark squared bishop wants to move, but if you move it now, you lose a bit of time over the next few turns. So, okay, really tense, again, psychological opening battle from these two players. Neither side actually trying to win right from the start, not really trying to punish the opponent in the opening. They're just trying to get a playable position. And, okay, as Ivanka mentioned, one of the options, trade a set of pawns, and when the white knight recaptures, which is most likely here, then the black dark squared bishop can just come out in one go and black can castle the king away to safety. I don't think Ding will capture with his pawn here because then the pawn structure will be just too symmetrical. Yeah, I would say as well, I would be surprised if that move were even popular. But it is, I was going to say, and it's been played by players such as Mamadjarov and Yilmaz, a famous grandmaster from Turkey. So it does have its advocates. Okay, I must admit, that's a new one for me. I'm learning something already in this opening stage. That's always good. And yeah, the pawn structure being symmetrical,
at least does favour white slightly, because white is ahead in development. When pawn structures are completely balanced like this, it's all about who has the most time, who can get the pieces to active squares first. And white is actually 2 moves ahead in development. White has already moved the light squared bishop, and white has castled the king away. It takes black 2 moves to do that, to play copycat. So Ding has 2 moves in his pocket over the next few turns to actually try and create some threats, some tension.
Yeah. And whilst we're waiting for Magnus to come up with a move, I wanted to share with you some selfies. And Ferdinand Bockenförder sends us greetings from Switzerland. I really like this. We had Switzerland, Chicago. We've had many countries in the world. We had Mexico yesterday. Love it. And Johnny Slaw actually has a question for you, David. He asks, who is your favourite opponent?
Ooh, interesting.
Oof. That's really tricky. There's 2 ways to answer that question. Who's my favourite opponent that I like to win against? And the other one is who's my favourite opponent to maybe test myself? Ooh, that's a really good question. I've never thought of it. Maybe my favourite opponent now is Magnus H10 on the app. But yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed playing against as strong players as possible, just to push myself, to learn a few things. Then again, I did enjoy my match maybe just a couple of weeks ago against Niels Grandelius. We hadn't actually played each other too much before that. We'd studied chess together, we were good friends, but I learnt so much. 10 games we played in 10 days, and I learnt an enormous amount. And yeah.
And what about who's your favourite opponent to win against? Who do you play and that you always have? Always get away with it. You have a bad position, doesn't matter. You turn it around, you win.
Hi, Simon. No, I'm joking. No, oh, that's tricky. I don't want to name names. How about you, Ivanka? Who's your favourite opponent?
Who's my favourite opponent? Yeah, like you, I do like the players who test you. One of the players, you know, I really enjoy playing against him. He's a good friend of mine. Is actually Grandmaster Stuart Conquest. I really enjoy our games because I feel like he's given me a mental workout because I can't figure out any of his moves. And
super creative, right?
Yeah, totally. And those kind of players I really enjoy because you feel like you have to be in tip-top shape, even though the positions themselves, when you look back on it, they might not seem that energetic or whatever. You just get this very intense sensation at the board.
Nice.
And meanwhile, a couple of moves in this game. So black has indeed castled, and it's very, very symmetrical, apart from the fact that white has a knight planted in the middle of the board in black's half as well, and that's very annoying. I don't think Magnus ever wants to go and capture that knight, because that knight will be just replaced by a very strong pawn. And actually, white is the one who initiates that exchange. I'm slightly surprised he rushed with that. But then again, black does have a shattered pawn structure on the left side of the board, especially black's A pawn now is an isolated pawn, and the black C pawn that has just moved a backward pawn. So in terms of strategic differences, white has maybe the more healthy pawn structure, but then again, the position has clarified in the center, and black, if he's accurate, should be okay in this type of structure. And okay, Magnus offering a trade of bishops. Just why not? That bishop was slightly passive, and white's bishop, the dark square bishop, was on an active diagonal. And Ivanka, who do you tend to prefer these pawn structures?
White.
White.
You know, I'm like a dog with a bone if you give me this type of position, you know. Backward pawn, I'm going to attack that pawn for the rest of its days and try and pile up pressure. And one of the things that I really like to do is I like to utilize this concept that was, I think, coined by Nimzovich, although I don't know whether he's the source, but it's just basically you control, you restrain, and you destroy. So first of all, you control that pawn, so you start attacking it. And then you start restraining it. By that, you stop it from advancing. And then you destroy, which basically means that you pile up as many of your pieces as possible because that target has been immobilized. And then you enjoy the fruits of all your hard work and you win that material.
Yeah, and actually, we predicted the moves. They have happened. And in this position, black actually has 2 weak pawns as well. This one is isolated, and it's kind of being stared at by white's bishop. So that keeps the black rook passive. Magnus decided to move that pawn. At least now his rook is free to kind of centralize itself later on. And Ding, kind of just occupying the square in front of the backward pawn, Very logical as well. As Jovanka mentioned, you want to attack it, you want to restrain it first, though. And this is one good way of restraining the pawn. White's knight is just glorious. It can never be removed from the square. The only way is to actually trade it off as black, but then you lose some of your dynamic potential if you trade off the knights. So Magnus wants to play with pieces instead, keeping the tension. And over the next few turns, I expect to see Ding try to build up, as Jovanka mentioned, against this pawn. This could involve, for example, stepping the queen forward, maybe lifting the rook up to the third rank, and doubling up the rooks on this c-file, stacking them up. Long term, this is the big target. And the reason I like this move as well with the white queen, okay, he hasn't gone for this yet, but you just keep an eye on this weakness. It's all about isolated pawns. Yes, white has one too in the centre of the board, but this is never really weak. It's easily defended. So Ding just playing copycat. Black centralised his rook on an open file, and he has done the same. If everything gets traded off, these two pawns are going to be eternally weak. Magnus needs to keep the queens on, though, and that's not normally his style. Normally he likes to head to the endgame. This time he really can't. That only favours Ding.
Huh. All right. Well, remember, they are tied, these two, after a first very long game. So the only thing about that very long game is that it's getting even later for Ding Liren. Now it's going to be way past 2 o'clock in the morning. And odds are this game, or this match, will go on for a long time to the early morning in China.
I just like that tweet. Vamonos, David. I have to say there's been a lot of love and cheer for David. Everyone's very proud that he beat Magnus age 10. We were all feeling it with you, David.
I just feel guilty. I kind of screamed at the end, and I hope nobody was listening with headphones because I might have deafened a few people. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, but we love that sports reaction, and obviously in chess over the board. That's not very possible. Have you ever been able to celebrate like that in over-the-board chess?
It's possible, I guess. I tend not to. I tend to kind of shake my hand, be respectful to the opponent, and then go back to my hotel room and either scream in excitement or disappointment. So
we actually have the reaction. Take a look at this.
Oh dear.
Oh, that is just pure joy. I love it. Look at that.
It's pretty sad that I'm getting this excited about beating a 10-year-old on an app.
But it is the world champion. Yes.
Yeah, but David, you did it with 3 seconds to spare as well, you know, so...
It was just such a perfect game, you know?
Living life on the edge.
You know, he was smoothly winning and then messed up a little bit, kept us all on our toes.
Yeah.
And then we were like, then it became a matter of counting, and then he did it, he found the right way, and it was too quick. And then it was just a case of beating the clock. So it had the whole storyline. This could be like the next Hollywood movie.
Oh, yeah.
David against Magnus, age 10. He's been training every single day.
If Netflix ever run out of story ideas, you know, call me up. But yeah, that's one bad habit of mine. It's always, I call it brinksmanship. It's always like on the edge, 3 seconds or just in time. And it's not good for the heart, but it does feel like a sport that way. And meanwhile, just one move, White's queen improving itself, as mentioned, just keeping her eye line on both sides of the board.
One of the advantages of online chess is that the clock is really apparent. Meanwhile, when you're playing over-the-board chess, sometimes it's not really clear whether you've made the next time control or not. And I once had a case with one of my students, and he didn't know whether they had added time. So he started blitzing and blitzing and blitzing, and then he thought he'd checkmated with like seconds to spare. And he was like, whew. And then everyone turned around to him. You do realise there was a second time control. And he was like, oh, okay.
That's why we write moves down sometimes.
Yeah.
People ask me why you write the moves down. Firstly, it's for our own records, but secondly, you might get added time after a certain number of moves.
Yeah, and it's important to check time control. Magnus, in Norway chess one year, right? He forgot to check the regulations, and he actually lost some time.
Yeah.
He let his time run out. He thought he was about to receive an extra 30 minutes, but nope.
Nope. Yeah, I remember everyone was watching this on live TV, and everyone was make a move, and there he was just
so calm,
settling into this long think.
I remember I commented on that game for TV2 Norway, and I remember we sat there 10 because we started to realize Magnus isn't. We actually had his manager Espen Agdestein in the studio. He said to us, "I don't think he knows the rules," and we counted down 10, 9, and then he lost some time. It's surreal.
Yeah, happens to the best of us.
Yeah.
So we always need to read the rules, read the regulations. Meanwhile, there have been some developments on the board, and I'm not so sure I like this for Ding. So Magnus found a way to trade off the knights, but in a really interesting way. So if we rewind just a few moves, we'll catch up with the current position. But here, I thought white had full control, but Magnus cleverly jumped in with his knight, not only attacking the white queen, but also trying to undermine this glorious piece on the outpost that we talked about a bit earlier. And therefore, Ding had to trade off the knights, and Black's rook got active. And maybe what Ding had not realised is that he cannot actually go and grab a pawn on the edge of the board now, because this would walk into a simple double attack, the rook coming across, threatening some checkmating ideas and threatening the bishop. And that forced Ding to just weaken his position. If he can't grab this pawn, he decided, OK, might as well hit this rook, kick it back. And after the rook stepped back, he's trying to initiate all these trades, trying to take off the pieces, because, as mentioned, that would favour white. But now Magnus has actually gone for trades on his terms. He's brought the queen across. He's saying, yes, you can exchange, but if you trade the queens off now, then there's a problem. White's pawn in the corner here is suddenly undefendable. And there's also tension with these rooks in the centre. If we see a trade, then, for example, this type of position, suddenly I think it might favour black. This rook just too strong, and if we see a trade of black's backward pawn for white's pawn here, then suddenly black's rook is the more active of the two. So suddenly things are turning in black's favour. White is the one having to be accurate, and Ding on the defensive suddenly after this queen move offering the trade. He couldn't capture, as we showed, so he just slides across with his rook, but he's lost a lot of time. He's retreated his bishop. He's lost 2 moves now with his rook. And Magnus, yeah, he's got everything covered. This rook doing an especially good job of just protecting this backward pawn.
It's impressive. Impressive play by Magnus, and the way that he's trying to kind of change the nature of the position. I mean, I honestly thought that Ding was just cruising for a small advantage, and it was going to be one that was going to be plaguing Magnus until the very end. But Magnus, no, he's turned it around, and he's saying, look, I have my dynamic possibilities. And as David's highlighting, there's a rook that can go on an open line. White, too, has some weak pawns, as David has again highlighted. And, yeah, I agree with you. It does feel like black is better.
Yeah. Or at least maybe white's OK, but white is the one having to be more accurate. And after this move, attacking this white B pawn, I'm expecting the pawn having to step up the board there. Then if Magnus just wants to play safe and just trade everything off, this is just very minimum. This is a very typical idea. You just push this pawn forward, and it's always good to trade your isolated pawns, your weak pawns, for your opponent's strong pawns. And here, this is just what we call a minority attack. This one pawn for black is undermining 2 white pawns. So we might well see a situation where, for example, there's a trade, and here white has these weaknesses. Maybe even safer is to just even trade the queens off and then go after this weak white pawn. I think this position at the very maximum is just going to be a draw for white, but maybe Magnus in the current position looking for even more, because the momentum, as we mentioned, is in his favour. So this is the safe option for black, using the rook, going for that minority attack, pushing pawns, trading pawns, but maybe he wants to keep the queens on. Maybe we'll see him be a bit more ambitious, maybe push this pawn to make white a bit uncomfortable. OK, he goes for the safe approach, shuffling his rook across. Let's go back to the players. Can Ding maintain the tension, or is Magnus going to neutralise him here? That's the question.
Do you think Magnus will be happy with the draw in this game with the black pieces?
I think he wouldn't mind. Maybe before the game he would have loved the draw, but the position he's got, maybe he's thinking, oh, some chances. I want to keep the game alive. I want to make Ding a bit nervous. Yeah, either way, evaluation bar roughly in the middle. I think Ding actually did a good job. We said things were turning against him. His last rook move just kind of just solidified everything. And, OK, as predicted, that white pawn was under fire and it had to step forward. I'm expecting Magnus now to push his A pawn, the isolated pawn, to undermine white's structure on the left.
Is there any chance that black can try to switch the queen and the rook around? I mean, that's what I would like to do here. Because I feel that, you know, yeah, trading queens, I like it. It's safe, it's good. But at the same time, white's king feels a little bit shaky.
Yeah, white's king on this dark square diagonal. It feels like white's pushed the wrong pawn in front of his king, right? So, yeah, that would make a lot of sense, keeping the queens on. I guess it's just weighing up whether you can get an attack quick enough as black against the white king, or whether your weaknesses, the backward pawn that we mentioned on the c6 square, whether those kind of pawns become just too vulnerable before your attack gets going. So, yeah, I mean, I would be tempted to move the black queen actually into the A3 square, maybe.
Me too. Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well.
Why are you saying, oh, like it's a scary move to make?
It is a little bit
Brave.
scary because, you know, you are kind of putting your queen completely offside. And if white catches you unawares on the right side of the board, well, OK, but the queens have traded themselves off. It was a bit of a hypothetical question that we set ourselves. But, yeah, we're going to see the line that you mentioned where, you know, black has a very pleasant position.
Yeah. Black does still have those weaknesses, but you can trade one of the weaknesses off, as mentioned, when you push your isolated pawn, and then your backward pawn, it's easily defendable. It's not too big an issue here. So roughly balanced.
Yeah, do you actually think that white's lone pawn in the middle of the board is going to be a real problem? It could be a target, right?
Possibly, but at the moment it's easily defended by white's rook. Yeah, I mean, Ding, maybe he'll bring the white king closer.
Yeah.
Hard to say right now. It looks like just...
Sorry. I can see you coughing, so I'll pass some water to you, David. And yeah, definitely something. Ding definitely has his chances to play on. He has a very straightforward plan of improving his pieces. He needs to improve his light square bishop. And the first thing that I would do is perhaps wait for black to advance the pawn and then centralize the king. And if he really wants to play it safe, start to trade off a set of rooks.
Okay. Well, still a lot of time left on the clocks for these two. And it is Ding thinking about what move to make. Remember, we do have the auction for that super successful gaming chair, Secret Lab gaming chair, used by Magnus Carlsen and the other players during the tour finals. And now also by David Owl when he beat Magnus Carlsen at 10 years old. And current bid is, let's check you guys. Current bid, $620, 1 hour and 24 minutes left to make your bid. All the money goes to UNICEF and the work they're doing in and around Ukraine. And this is a very unique chair. First of all, it's a great gaming chair made by Secret Lab. I can confirm it's super comfortable, but also it has success engraved in it by world champion Magnus Carlsen, Jan-Christoph Duda Anish Giri, and Grandmaster David Howell.
Yeah.
Oh, and jackets off for Ding Liren. It's getting serious.
It is getting serious, okay. And, well, Ding actually improving the light squared bishop a little bit, and Magnus stepping forward with his pawn. And Operation Trade-Off has begun.
Yeah, so as mentioned, just why not trade things off, especially if you have weak pawns? And two options here for Ding. You can just take that pawn off the board. He goes for that. That's the safer option. Or you could have dropped back the white light squared bishop. But, OK, now Ding lifting his rooks. And notice how he's putting the rooks on the dark squares where they can't be targets for black's bishop. And, OK, white is the one with the two isolated pawns now. So it's time for the kings to centralize themselves. It's a similar phase of the game that we actually saw in game one, where the status quo was kind of maintained for a while and both kings started making their way towards the center, just in readiness, in anticipation of the rooks coming off and maybe a pawn race later on. The kings are essential pieces right now. And it's maybe easier for black to improve his king than it is for white. White's king is kind of cut off. Black's rook on the E line, just stopping it from kind of moving over to the left side of the board. But then again, it's not exactly clear where the black king is going either. So who would you take here, Jovanka, if you had to choose a side?
If I have to take sides, because you're forcing me to, I would probably choose the black position. Feels more familiar to me somehow. I'm kind of, you know, pawns and light square strategy. It's something that I kind of...
This could arise from your beloved
exactly. And I do really like how Ding has handled this, though. You know, he's mobilized his bishop, and the pawn sitting on A2, Alice, you know, she could be a liability, but she could also be a strength.
Wow, an interesting decision taken by Magnus here. He's offering a rook trade, but it looks like it looks a bit odd. If white takes your rook now, you get double pawns as black. I guess the idea is that white's remaining rook is unable to really fight against the pawns. And this is where we talk about breaking the rules by the top players. Black's putting his rook here, allows this trade, ruining his own pawn structure. These two pawns now really, really ugly, but it's a kind of dynamic thing. It's just because on this next move, white is unable to stop this pawn advancing. If you could somehow magic the white king over, if you could kind of plant it in front of this black pawn, then white is simply winning. Black's pawns are just too ugly, but here, this pawn just too strong. So this trade was not possible for Ding. Really instructive there by Magnus, and Ding trying to get in with his rook to the 7th rank. This has been met by Magnus preempting this by bringing his king up the board. If white's rook tries to go active now, then black can simply neutralize it by offering a trade. And yeah, suddenly this black rook on an active square still. And OK, Ding, instead of going for a rook trade, brings his rook to the top of the board. He's going to try and annoy black from behind, maybe with a check, maybe by going after some of the black pawns over here.
And what about the plan of pushing pawns? My favourite thing in the world, Alice.
Yeah.
She wants to run to her destination. I mean, how dangerous is it? I mean, visually, it looks very dangerous.
Yeah.
Should black be worried?
I mean, if all the rooks suddenly came off, then definitely. And even with these two rooks right now, they're not actually ready. They don't look well positioned to stop the advance of this A pawn, as you mentioned, Ivanka. So maybe hints of Ding pushing this pawn, at least using her as a distraction, while Magnus has to worry about what to do. I don't think Magnus can really trade everything off here. He wants to go after just exchanges, just swapping things off, maybe activating the black king, but this would allow, for example, a nasty check. And suddenly the black king, it can't step towards the white rook because this would just lose a pawn or two in the center of the board. And also, if you go to a light square, there will be consequences. I'm imagining white's bishop coming forward, or maybe you can just capture a pawn in the center to open up both white rooks against this pawn in the middle of the board. Yeah, really awkward, actually, now suddenly for Magnus. I would have said black as well, possibly, a couple of moves ago, but just Ding positioning his pieces really actively has caused some headaches for the world champion, this rook especially on its own. How do you deal with it? How do you contain it? It's just, this is why we want rooks on open files. And here, the rook's on a completely open line, and it could slide back at any moment. It's just the best piece in the position. It's the star player. And black's rook, meanwhile, trying to compete by activating itself, but it's hitting thin air, unfortunately. And it's got less scope than white's does in the corner.
But it's a smart move, because I can see that Magnus is worried about the pawn advance. And so his idea is that after the pawn advances, rook's behind past pawns.
Yeah, exactly. And the rook, yeah, that's really nice, really instructive, guarding the pawn from behind. And suddenly, even if the white pawn continues to advance, at least the rook is trapped in front of it. So I don't think Ding wants to rush with that idea. You don't want to allow the black rook behind, where it is active. Instead, Magnus, in this position, just improves his bishop again. But the bishop did come from here a couple of moves ago. So interesting, the bishop's been kind of yo-yoing back and forth and back and forth. And, OK, Magnus, it feels like time to maybe improve this rook. This rook, I praised it a while ago for guarding the 6th rank, but it's done its job there. Maybe it's time to slide it back and try to bring it to other open files.
And game 2 between Duda and Liren ended in a draw, meaning Duda is still up by 1 point. And actually, if he wins game 3, he will be ready for the final in the Charity Cup. Liren, he will need at least a draw in the next game, but with the white pieces, we know he's going to be going for the win in that game. And hopefully we're going to have time to go to that as well. Well, we will have time to see that game as well. Because this one, do you think it's going to be as long as the first game? In terms of moves, we had 110 moves in the first game.
It's possible. I mean, it's going to be a long one. I mean, it's rare to see any game reach move 100. Maybe 1 in every 20 games gets there, but if that. But yeah, still a lot of life left in this one.
Yeah.
And it's all about the pawn imbalances. The pieces look roughly similar. Rooks, bishops, they just kind of balance each other out. But white has this passed pawn, as we mentioned, the A pawn, and black's 2 versus 1 in the center. Less effective right now, but could also become a factor. So, yeah, still a lot of life left. Both sides have reason to be hopeful. If black can pick off white's central isolated pawn, the black will win. If white's pawn can run up the board, the A pawn, white's going to be in charge. Yeah, I'm still struggling to decide who I'd rather be here. It's just that kind of position. There's pros and cons for both sides. It's just about who can maneuver better in this endgame. Usually we would say that's Magnus, but the reason Magnus fears Ding or respects Ding is because Ding is equally good in this type of position.
Yeah.
in endgames.
Yeah, I mean,
It's universal, I think.
Yeah, we actually saw it yesterday in his endgame, the night endgame against Jordan Van Forest. I mean, it started off as a level endgame, and then, you know, Ding, with not so much time left on the clock, actually started playing very accurately and found some really nice ways to secure a victory. And yeah, I mean, I think David is totally right. I mean, here the position depends on who is going to maneuver in the best way. And for me, I also agree with David. The rook sitting on the e6 square, it's not working. It needs to do something. And I would be even tempted to try and find ways to trade it off.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. You would love to also trade it off for this white rook in the corner.
Exactly.
Just that white rook is just too annoying on every turn. The reason Magnus is actually spending so long and going low on the clock is because on every turn you have to calculate that white rook coming across with a check or hitting some pawns. And okay, wow, black's rook's really intruding into white's half now. They've ganged up on the third row, maybe hinting at going across to that A file to block white's pass pawn over there.
Yeah, and trade off rooks, which is
Trade off
what we
rooks.
wanted.
Yeah,
And Magnus finding a very creative way how to achieve this.
really logical. Just aesthetically, we're not used to seeing this type of setup with the black rooks.
No.
Just visually, it looks a bit odd and unusual, but it could be effective. And as you mentioned, there's a clear plan in mind, and that's normally a sign that a move is good, if there's a clear follow-up plan. So, yeah, back to white deciding whether to push pawns, whether to give checks with that white rook at the top of the board. If you want to move it, where to? White's bishop at the moment, and the rook on the second rank, not really helping, not really coordinating with that rook in the corner.
Yeah. And whilst we're waiting for Ding to come up with a plan, because it looks like he's wasn't expecting that move and he was a little bit surprised, I'd like to share with you one quick selfie by Cherry Puffling. Oh, and he does make a commitment and he pushes Alice, the A-pawn. And, well, suddenly...
Wow.
The moves have come thick and fast, and the pawn has suddenly found its way from A2 all the way up to the 6th row.
Wow, in seconds.
Yeah.
We talked about my game having 3 seconds left earlier against Magnus H10, but literally within 3 seconds, that white pawn went from the 2nd rank to the 6th rank. It's as if it just hopped up. Meanwhile, black just manoeuvring his rooks. That white pawn still could advance 1 square further, but at least it's got a black rook behind it, keeping an eye on its advance. This is really scary for Magnus, though, because that white pawn on the 6th rank is also defended by its bishop. So the white rook can still swing across. And actually, black is a bit stuck. One of your rooks is going to be paralyzed forever, guarding the advance of that pawn. And yeah, the evaluation bar, not too excited, but from a human point of view, this is huge progress on Ding's part. He's made a huge leap with that pawn.
Oh, that looks scary.
It is.
Magnus.
It is scary. It is, like, visually, it totally is. When you kind of step back and you're a little bit ice cold about it, I don't think it's that scary because black's rook keep a watchful eye over that pawn. Having said that, it's very difficult for Ding to find a plan, and it's also very difficult for Magnus to do the same.
Yeah, and just to mention, so in this position, white would love to push this pawn forward. For example, he could have pushed it on the last go, and some viewers at home might be wondering, why can't this pawn step forward? Next move, if black is careless, for example, then the rook will come across with a check, the king will move, and then you promote. You make a new queen, defended by the rook, and you actually win one of black's rooks in the process. But the answer would have been, no, you really shouldn't push this pawn forward yet. You needed your bishop to keep defending it, because once you push forward, the black king is actually going to step back. And now, no more checks for this white rook. This rook cannot go anywhere. Wherever you move it, this black pawn will drop. For example, actually, you can swing it across, but this would just result in an exchange, and black would have got rid of that important A-pawn. So in the current position, if we catch up with the game, we saw white just being a bit more patient. Notice how keeping his pawn on the square covered by its bishop, and just giving a check as well with the white rook. So now if the black king does move away and continue guarding its pawns, I think white's idea was to go after this backward pawn that we've been talking about for most of the game. Instead, Magnus preventing this idea by dropping his bishop back, walking into a pin, but at least cutting off the access of the white rook to the other half of the board. And still yet to find a winning plan for Ding. It's still looking good for him visually for white, but this pawn under lock and key for now.
Wow. And I wonder if Ding Liren is able to win this game, if he's going to have a huge celebration like David had when winning against Magnus 10. I did see in comments on our hash chess champs on Twitter a lot of appreciation for seeing that kind of joy after a great win.
Yeah, and we also did have a request that David, next time he beats Magnus H10, does a Cristiano Ronaldo victory. What's it?
When he
That one.
Next time, maybe.
shirt off.
Nobody wants to see that. shirt
Yeah,
off.
then we're talking celebrations.
And I have a suspicion that David's reaction might be making its way into a meme.
Oh,
Nice.
I know what our viewers are like. That's definitely going to happen. Why did you say that, Ivanka?
Oh, but that's such
Sorry.
a cool meme.
It is a very cool meme, yeah.
I love that celebration. I mean, it's power. Loved it.
And maybe we'll see a celebration from one of these two if they win, because it is that big a matchup.
I can hardly imagine, though, Liren celebrating like that. I mean, we have seen it from Magnus, actually, when he won, was it the FTX Crypto Cup against Wesley So in Armageddon? Huge celebration.
Yeah.
It looked like he was about to rip off his shirt. and-
Yeah, it actually did. But yeah, Liren doesn't strike me as the type.
Not outwardly.
Yeah, I think we might have seen him do
We've seen him smile, a fair bit,
and
maybe a few
maybe
fist bumps.
fist pumps.
Yeah.
My
Not the same as screaming, but
My favorite reaction was the flowers from
I know.
David Navarro.
Yeah, that was very cute.
totally unexpected and
Yeah.
very, very sweet.
Yeah, when he won against Magnus in the preliminaries.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the most emotional moments I've had from just watching chess purely was at the World Cup a few years ago when Ding lost the final of the World Cup. And he just went to sit in the corner, just kind of, and you could see the emotion on him. He was trying to hide his tears, hide his disappointment. But yeah, I mean, that was one of the first times just on someone's behalf, I thought, oh,
Yeah.
this is really sad. And yeah, it would be nice to see. I mean, after such a difficult couple of years for him, unable to play, travel, it was nice to see him have a few good results this coming year.
Well, and definitely anger is something we can see in chess after some losses. Definitely in the Meltwater Champions chess tour, I remember once seeing Nepomniachtchi throw his mouse into the wall. I also remember it was a Rapid and Blitz World Championship in Berlin. Magnus just threw a pen. That was actually over the board chess.
Yeah, I remember that because my hairdressers all commented and they said we didn't like that behaviour from Magnus. Can you imagine even having that conversation with your hairdresser? But in Norway, you can.
Yeah.
Chess is that popular. And definitely we have seen reactions. I've seen a rook being thrown.
Really?
Yeah.
Who was that?
Yeah. It wasn't her finest moment.
I do like the big reactions. All right, some moves. Is Ding... Well, okay, the bar is now over to Magnus' side.
Yeah, I think the bar just yet to make up his decision because it is still roughly balanced, but Ding really going for it. He's trying to initiate something. If White just wanted to sit, he would have done, but look at White's last pawn push. Okay, Black moving the rook back. If White's pawn had been captured by Black's bishop, the White rook would have slid across on the 7th rank and captured a pawn. If that pawn, the White F pawn, would have been captured by a pawn, the Black H pawn would have dropped off. So White's pawn there, actually, it looks like just a fearless foot soldier just running up the board, but it could not actually be captured safely. It would have just resulted in a trade. So Ding actually trying to open up some lines, trying to get some action. He's already dominant now on the left side of the board with his A pawn. He's trying to create a second avenue of attack. But Magnus is saying no, he's locking things down. And his rook retreat actually completely kind of cages White's rook on the A7 square. It can only move out now with an exchange. It's no longer the active piece it previously was. So really interesting. It's still hard to call. And wow, Ding, that's a huge commitment. This is either going to be a genius move that wins the game for White later, or it's going to be something that Ding lives to regret, because this pawn push, Ivanka, that pawn is weak.
That pawn is weak. Very, very weak.
That pawn could drop off later in the game. You could envisage, not yet, but later, Black's king just stepping across and picking off this white pawn that has just moved.
So Ding is actually just using tactical tricks to keep that pawn safe. So his idea is if Black does try to be greedy, so for instance moves the king round to the middle of the board to attack the knight, then maybe moves such as pushing the g-pawn 2 squares forward will start troubling Black, because you can't capture the pawn, because after bishop takes pawn, whoops, you drop a bishop. So that's not possible. And if you're allowing this pawn move, then you're going to allow White to set up that pawn chain. That is the dream
And wow, Magnus has actually played that move. Really surprising. He's actually trying to provoke White to achieve something maybe he wanted to do anyway. And look at the evaluation bar. It's shot up for Ding. And it might be down to this move Jovanka's highlighted, pushing this pawn forward. This pawn is taboo. You can't capture it. And also, remember, you can't capture this pawn either. It's poisoned because suddenly the black bishop would drop off. The black king, was tied down defending its bishop. And wow, Ding didn't go for this opportunity, pushing a pawn forward. This looked very, very kind of simple and pretty strong. And he didn't go for it. He offers the trade of rooks instead. And the evaluation bar drops back down. So maybe a moment of both sides just semi-bluffing there and Ding not wanting to commit his pawns. Now, a rook trade would, I think, favour White slightly because suddenly, again, the black king, unable to capture this pawn, needs to defend its bishop, and black's active rook has disappeared. Instead, Magnus keeps the rooks on the board, trying to create some counterplay using this pin.
But I think Ding has been very, very clever because, he's offered a trade which Magnus couldn't accept. And now look at it. He's mobilized his rook. The rook is primed to join its sibling.
This rook,
Yeah, is primed to join its sibling onto the 7th row.
Yep, check, and then 7th rank.
Yep, and also, you still have this idea of pushing the g-pawn 2 squares forward in reserve. You've got it in your pocket, as you say. It feels really quite dangerous, like Magnus is living a little bit on the edge.
Yeah, really scary now for Magnus to survive. It looks like Ding, with this rook check and bringing it to the 7th rank, creating some real winning chances.
All right. And Magnus, 1 minute and 43 seconds left. Ding, 2 minutes left now. How hard will this be to play for Magnus if he now takes under the minute? It's going
to be a dramatic game because, driving that rook down to the 7th row, that is a kind of committal decision because the rook could get caught on the 7th. It could have been trapped. Say black has moved his bishop 1 square along the diagonal rather than offering this bishop trade.
Wow, both sides playing for the win.
Yeah.
There's actually a trap at some point. If the black bishop ever leaves the diagonal, if, for example, the black bishop captures the white bishop, White's rook now will actually slide across 2 squares and checkmate the black king. The d7 square, just the one behind the black king, that one needs to be guarded by black's bishop. Otherwise, it's just checkmate in this endgame. So, yeah, right now, also tension between these 2 rooks. Would you capture, Jovanka? Would you trade off one set of rooks? Those 2 white rooks together look fantastic on the 7th rank. But if you trade off now with black, that rook is replaced by White's pawn. White's A pawn, Alice, will become a B pawn and 1 square away from promotion.
Yes, hang on a second. We have a little bit of a...
Do you have to go for that?
Do you have to?
That's the big question. If you move the black rook away, that black rook is going to end up on a terrible square. There's still, we should mention, a pin on the 2nd rank. So White's bishop cannot move right now. It's pinned to its king. But yeah, suddenly, Magnus, look at this. He has captured the rook. That is ice cold. Just decision-making. Now the white pawn is going to take back. What else is there for Ding? OK, he showed a bit of frustration there. Maybe he thought he was winning on the spot, but black's rook can guard this pawn for now.
And now black is threatening bishop takes bishop.
Yeah.
Forcing the white rook to leave the defense of its B pawn. And Ding has lost a pawn.
Yeah. Maybe Ding can preserve his pawn by making a new queen here, distracting the black rook from the 2nd rank pin. But that would be a bad sign. That would mean that he's fighting for the draw, suddenly.
Yeah, he has to do that. That's the only way.
That's the only way. He has to promote that white B pawn. It's so counterintuitive, not obvious for a human. That's your pride and joy, that white pawn now 1 square away from promotion. You actually have to give it up right now. Because otherwise you might just lose the game. Because otherwise, as Jovanka mentioned, you're pinned with your bishop. You can't move your bishop. He does make a new queen. He had to release the tension with the bishops. And, OK, after that transition, White giving up a pawn, the bishop trade, White has actually also managed to regain the pawn himself with a rook. So now it's anyone's game still, this endgame. It looks like it should be a draw according to the computer, but look at the pawn structure. It's really imbalanced. White still has a pawn on the 6th rank. Black has double pawns. Black has a 2 versus 1 advantage in the centre. It's imbalanced still.
It's a crazy rook and pawn ending because, if Magnus really wants to spice things up, once Ding runs with his king, say he chooses to run with his king to the right, well,
The black rook is going to go after the pawn in the middle of the board.
And, he hasn't gone for this. He could have maybe gone for the win here, Magnus, but this would have entailed a lot of risk.
Yeah.
Instead, he's moving towards this far advanced white pawn. And he's hoping that if the rook moves out the way, then at the very least he can just capture it and remove white's remaining winning chances. Here, for example, I think black is active enough. OK, we're going for this position. Black is active enough going for white's pawn in the centre to hold the draw. It's still anyone's game, but it looks like the players have found a way to both at least remove some risk from the position.
And game 3 between Liam and Jan-Christoph Duda has just started. If Duda wins that game, he's going to be ready for his very first Meltwater Champions Chess Tour final. Liam needs at least a draw, and he has to win either this game or the next one to take it to tiebreaks. We will jump into that game when this one finishes. But could it be a long game still?
Yep.
It could be still, but with this last move, it's looking like maybe Ding has found a way to just eliminate another couple of pawns. The more pawns that disappear, the less likely it becomes that we'll be with this game for too long. So now I'm expecting black's rook to give a check. You always want to drive your opponent's king back to passivity. White's king was nicely placed on the third rank. Drive it away. So that check was important, and now black defends his own pawn. And we might see the end of this game any moment. Yep, they are repeating, nothing else to do. Black defends the pawn, gives a check, threefold repetition, it's a draw.
Both of them shaking their heads. It looked like Magnus is going to...